I didn't know the stroke would be the easy part. Lying in a hospital bed at 71, I kept waiting for footsteps in the hallway. A voice I recognized. Someone who would sit down and say, "I'm here." No one came. The doctors said I was lucky. But luck doesn't feel like being forgotten. On the third day, a nurse asked me gently, "Are you expecting visitors?" That's when I found out my children were boarding a plane. Not to come see me, but to go to Europe. I lay there staring at the ceiling, realizing something I had never allowed myself to think before. If I died that week, would anyone even notice? My name is Margaret Collins. And this is the story of the moment I stopped waiting for my family to show up. Sometimes, it isn't the illness that hurts the most. It's realizing who disappears when you need them. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 71 years old. And before I tell you what happened, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? I like knowing that these words are reaching living rooms, kitchens, quiet bedrooms, places where other women might be listening, maybe nodding softly, feeling that familiar ache in their chest. Because this story began in a place where time feels frozen. A hospital room. White walls. Soft beeping machines. A plastic bracelet around my wrist with my name spelled slightly wrong. I had suffered a mild stroke. The doctors told me I was fortunate. They said it wasn't severe. That I'd arrived quickly enough. That with rest, I would recover. They used the word lucky. But as the hours stretched into days, that word started to feel cruel. Because while I lay there, weak and frightened, my family, the people I had built my entire life around, were nowhere to be seen. At first, I made excuses for them. My son Andrew worked in corporate finance. His schedule was always full of meetings and deadlines. My daughter Rebecca had children of her own. I told myself she was overwhelmed. They lived less than half an hour away. I kept thinking any moment now, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway. A familiar voice. Laughter. Someone bringing me a sweater or asking how I felt. No one came. On the third day, I finally asked the nurse if anyone had called for me. She checked the computer, then looked back with an expression that made my stomach sink. "No," she said softly. Then she hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. "Your family must be traveling," she added gently. I heard some of the staff mention it. Traveling? The word echoed in my ears. I asked what she meant, and after a pause, she admitted she'd overheard a conversation at the nurse's station. My children had gone to Europe. Europe. While I was lying in a hospital bed, wondering if I'd wake up the next morning, they were boarding planes, smiling for photos, clinking glasses in cities I'd only ever seen in magazines. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It seeped in slowly, like cold water spreading through my veins. I thought about the nights I'd stayed awake when Andrew was sick as a child, the mornings I packed Rebecca's lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside. The sacrifices I made after my husband passed away so they could attend good schools and have opportunities one never did. And now, not even a phone call, not a text. That night, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of machines, and a thought crept in, one I had never allowed myself to think before. Maybe I wasn't family anymore. Maybe I was just useful. A backup plan. A wallet. A place they could return to when it suited them, but love? Care? Presence? Those had quietly disappeared. When the doctor finally cleared me to leave, I expected relief. Instead, a heavy dread settled in my chest. Because home no longer meant safety. It meant realizing that my absence hadn't been noticed at all. When I was discharged, no one came to pick me up. The nurse helped me into a wheelchair and waited a moment, as if someone might appear at the last second. When no one did, she quietly called a rideshare for me and tucked a blanket around my legs. "Take care of yourself," she said, squeezing my hand. I nodded, too tired to explain that I wasn't sure who self included anymore. The house was silent when I walked in. No flowers. No note. No sign that anyone had noticed I'd been gone. My suitcase still sat by the door from the last time my children had visited, months ago. Dust coated the hallway table. The refrigerator hummed, nearly empty except for condiments and a carton of expired milk. I lowered myself onto the couch and just sat there. That was when my phone buzzed. A message from Rebecca, "Hope you're feeling better. We're still overseas. Be back soon." That was it. No apology. No explanation. No question about whether I needed help. I stared at the screen, then set the phone down face down, afraid I might say something I couldn't take back. Over the next few days, I began to notice things I'd never paid attention to before. Mail piled up faster than usual. Bank notifications showed unfamiliar withdrawals. A utility bill had been paid early, from an account I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. I logged into my online banking, squinting at the screen, scrolling slowly. That was when I saw it. A transfer labeled temporary loan. The amount made my breath catch. I hadn't approved it. I hadn't been asked. I called Andrew. He didn't answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. Later that evening, Rebecca finally picked up. "Oh, hi, Mom," she said, distracted. I could hear music and laughter in the background. "Did you take money from my account?" I asked quietly. There was a pause. "Andrew said he'd explain," she replied. "We needed it for the trip." "Just for a bit." "For the trip." The words landed heavier than the diagnosis ever had. "You didn't think to tell me?" I asked. "Mom, don't make this a big deal," she said. "You weren't even using the money." I hung up before she could say more. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed listening to the creaks of a house I had paid for, maintained, and filled with love for decades. And yet, somehow, it no longer felt like mine. I realized then that the hospital hadn't been the moment everything changed. It was simply the moment I was no longer useful enough to be included, and if they felt comfortable taking from me while I was lying in a hospital bed. What else had they already decided without my consent? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the filing cabinet. It sat in the corner of the guest room, stuffed with folders I'd labeled carefully decades ago: insurance, taxes, property records. Over time, I had trusted my children to handle things, telling myself it was easier that way. That morning, I realized how wrong I had been. I pulled out the folder marked house. Inside were documents I barely remembered signing. Forms Andrew had brought to me years earlier, explaining they were just updates or temporary adjustments. At the time, I hadn't questioned him. He was my son. But now, reading slowly, line by line, my hands began to shake. The house, the one I had lived in for over 30 years, was no longer solely in my name. It had been transferred into a family trust one didn't recognize. A trust managed by an LLC registered under Andrew's name. I sat back in the chair, stunned. They hadn't just borrowed money. They had been planning. I checked the dates. The trust had been created 3 years earlier, long before my stroke, long before the hospital, long before they left for Europe without telling me. This wasn't panic. This was preparation. I called the county records office to confirm what I was seeing. The clerk was polite, almost cheerful, as she verified the information. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Your property is scheduled for transfer upon your incapacitation." Incapacitation. The word echoed in my head. I asked what that meant. "It means," she explained gently, "if you're declared unable to manage your affairs, the trustee gains full control." I hung up the phone and stared at the wall. My children hadn't just gone on vacation while I was in the hospital. They had waited. Waited to see if I would recover. Waited to see if I would be strong enough to notice. I thought back to conversations I'd brushed off. "Mom, you don't need to worry about paperwork anymore. We're just helping you plan ahead. Trust us." Trust. That word tasted bitter now. I realized something painful but clarifying. If I said nothing, they would take everything, quietly, legally, and without ever calling it betrayal, but if I acted now, while I was still considered capable, I still had a choice. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a real estate attorney. The second was to my bank. By the time the sun set, I wasn't just a mother recovering from a stroke anymore, was a woman who understood exactly what was at stake. And I wasn't done yet. The attorney confirmed what I already suspected. Legally, I was still competent. Legally, the house was still mine, at least for now. But not for long. If your children succeed in having you declared incapacitated, she said carefully, control could shift very quickly. I thanked her and ended the call, my hands resting on the kitchen table. For the first time since the hospital, fear wasn't the strongest emotion I felt. Clarity was, they had made their plans quietly, assuming I would remain passive. That I would stay grateful. That illness had weakened my judgment. They were wrong. The next morning, I contacted a real estate agent named Caroline Brooks. She spoke with calm efficiency, unaware that she was about to change the course of my life. I'd like to list my home, I told her. There was a brief pause. Of course, she replied. Is everything okay? Yes, I said. And for the first time, I meant it. Caroline came by that afternoon. She walked through each room slowly, noting the hardwood floors I'd polished myself, the windows I'd paid to replace, the garden I'd planted after my husband passed away. You've taken very good care of this place, she said. I smiled. I had to, I replied. It was my responsibility. By the end of the visit, the paperwork was ready. I signed my name without hesitation. As the for sale sign went up a few days later, something inside me steadied. This wasn't revenge. It was protection. Andrew called that evening, his voice tight. Mom, why is the house listed? He demanded. We were supposed to talk about this. We talked, I said calmly. Years ago. You just didn't realize it. Rebecca texted next. Then called. Then left a voicemail filled with confusion and accusation. You're being dramatic. This affects all of us. You didn't even tell us. I listened to none of it. Because for once, their panic told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't been worried about my health. They had been worried about their timing. As offers began to come in, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Relief. Because every signature, every document, every step forward reminded me of one simple truth. I was still here. I was still capable. And I was done waiting quietly while others planned my life without me. The sale wasn't final yet. But when it was, nothing would ever be the same again. The house sold faster than I expected. 2 weeks after it was listed, Caroline called me early in the morning. We have a solid offer, she said. Cash. No contingencies. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the window where sunlight spilled across the floor I had scrubbed on my knees years earlier. Accept it, I said. When the paperwork was finalized, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Finality. The money was transferred into an account under my name only. No shared access. No family oversight. Just mine. That's when the calls became frantic. Andrew showed up at the house unannounced, his face flushed with anger. You had no right, he said, standing in the doorway. That house was part of our future. Our? I asked quietly. Yes, ours, he insisted. We made plans around it. Plans. The word no longer hurt the way it once did. You made plans, I corrected him. Without me. Rebecca arrived later, tears in her eyes, but they didn't soften me. You embarrassed us, she said. People are asking questions. I looked at my children, grown adults who had boarded planes to Europe while I lay in a hospital bed, and felt a strange calm settle over me. You left me in a hospital, I said evenly. You took money without asking. You transferred my home into a trust without my consent. They stared at me, stunned, not by the truth, but by the fact that I was finally saying it out loud. This isn't about embarrassment, I continued. It's about entitlement. Andrew scoffed. You're overreacting. You're 71, Mom. You don't need all that money. That was the moment something inside me closed for good. I need dignity, I said. And I paid for that house with my life. They left shortly after. Angry. Disoriented. Empty-handed that night, I walked through each room one last time. The walls were bare now. The furniture gone. Only echoes remained. But instead of grief, I felt light. Because the house was no longer a trap. It was a chapter, one I had finally finished writing, and for the first time since the hospital, I slept without fear of what would be taken from me next. After the house was sold, I didn't rush into anything. No dramatic speeches. No public explanations. No attempts to make anyone understand. I rented a small apartment on the edge of town, quiet, sunlit, easy to manage. The kind of place people downsize into, not get pushed out of. For the first few weeks, my phone stayed silent. No calls from Andrew. No messages from Rebecca. At first, that hurt more than I expected. But then I realized something important. For the first time in my life, the silence wasn't punishment. It was peace. I set up my days slowly. Morning walks. Physical therapy exercises the doctor had recommended. Cooking meals for myself, simple ones, eaten at my own pace, began to notice how much of my life had been shaped around other people's needs. Their schedules. Their expectations. Their plans for a future that didn't include my voice. Without that weight, I felt lighter. Stronger. A month later, my attorney confirmed everything was final. The funds were secure. The trust had no claim over me. Legally, completely, and unquestionably, I was free. She asked if I wanted to revise my will. Yes, I said. I want it to reflect who actually shows up. That evening, I sat by the window watching the sky change colors and thought about the hospital room, the fear, the loneliness, the moment I realized I had been left behind. If that hadn't happened, I might still be living quietly inside a life someone else was planning for me. This story isn't about punishing my children. It's about choosing myself. About understanding that love doesn't take without asking. That care doesn't disappear when it's inconvenient. And that being a mother doesn't mean surrendering your dignity. If you're watching this and you feel invisible, if people have started making decisions for you instead of with you, please know this. It is not too late to speak. It is not selfish to protect yourself. And your worth does not diminish with age. I didn't lose my family. I reclaimed my life. And that was worth everything.